Welcome back to part 2 of our special ed intro. So we just finished talking about Kentucky's requirements for the 3 tiers of interventions. So if we have a student who's moved through Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 interventions, and they still aren't making appropriate progress, what we do is get parent permission to begin the testing for special education eligibility to see if a student is actually eligible for special education services. Within the current system, under both NCLB and ESSA, there is not a requirement for parent permission to participate in the tiers of intervention. There is a requirement to inform parents, but not to obtain their permission. But before we can begin testing for special education, we must have parent permission. It is not an option. We may not inform them. If a parent denies permission for testing, that is their due process right, and no testing can begin for special education if a parent or guardian of the child says no. So after we have permission to test, then very specific federal and state guidelines and timelines go into effect, and that child and parent or guardian have very specific rights that are called their due process rights within that process. And every parent or guardian, it is a requirement that the district, the LEA as it is known, give parents a copy of their rights in their native language, and that we explain those rights to them. Which sums up in a nutshell that if a parent or guardian is not happy at any stage of the process, then they have the rights to what is called mediation or due process rights. So we're going to assume that a student went through all 3 tiers and was not making progress. We called a ARC meeting, or an admissions and release committee meeting, which is what Kentucky calls those special education process meetings, and the parent has given permission. Then we can begin testing. So once we begin testing, and if a student is found eligible for special education under one of the 14 categories that we discussed earlier, then that student would have an IEP, which is an individualized education program. It is exactly what the 3 words say. It's individualized, so developed only for that student based on that student's very specific strengths and needs. It has to do with their educational process and is a program that must be implemented. It is not optional. Once an IEP is created by that committee and adopted, then it must be implemented and reviewed at least annually. It is more than just a plan, but an individualized education program, or an IEP, must be implemented in every day of the student's education program. A student does not qualify for special education services and an IEP if they do not need what we call specially designed instruction, or in other words, special education services. They have to require that in order to make progress, to be able to access the general curriculum, and everyone at this stage is responsible for implementation of a student's IEP. Most students with disabilities are educated primarily in the general education classroom with support from special education teachers for that specially designed instruction that they require to access the curriculum. Kentucky does a fantastic job of providing supports for students and teachers of students with disabilities, and one of those supports is called the Guidance Document for IEPs. It's updated annually. This is the most current version. It can be found on the KDE website and has 90 pages of very detailed information helping all teachers understand what needs to be as a requirement in an IEP to support student learning. There's a very specific process for developing an IEP, and an IEP always begins, is implemented, and ends with progress monitoring. So we are constantly evaluating if the services that we are providing a student are helping them make progress. And then we're evaluating that data to see if something different is needed, and developing that present levels, what the student is currently able to do, and then continuing on through the IEP process to ensure that every part of the students' required learning needs are met in order for them to make access to the general curriculum. This includes what we call special factors, which can include if a student requires services because they qualify under the area of blindness, deafness, if they need communication supports, behavioral supports, language supports, if there's anything else that goes with their world. That present levels is a data-driven section that addresses the student's strengths and needs based on their disability eligibility. We must have measurable annual goals, so not just vague goals. John will make progress in reading, but rather you have to know from the present levels what John is currently able to do and then where we would like to go. And remember from the first part, we're always looking at that Andrew F. standards if the goals are appropriately ambitious to help the student make progress towards the Kentucky academic standards. All students within special education must receive and require specially designed instruction. That is something that the special education teacher does to help the student access the curriculum. Things like explicit instruction, visual supports, using scaffolded instruction for specific skills and strategies. The supplementary aids and services are what the student needs to access the curriculum. So some students will require a reader or a scribe or the use of technology. They might require some specific behavior supports. Accommodations are a version of the supplementary aids and services. It's what the student is eligible to have during testing opportunities, and those are very specifically set out by the state. Some students require what we call program modifications and supports. So if the adults supporting the student learning need something specific, like training in a special area, that is often listed there. And then the participation in general education and least restrictive environment talk about what special education supports the student needs and how much time they will spend in the general education setting and, if necessary, in a resource or smaller setting for specific periods of the day. Then when and why does that happen? And throughout this whole process, we are still monitoring progress on goals to ensure we're helping the student move towards greater access of the curriculum. So what role does data play and progress monitoring play in special education? Data plays a huge role in special education. Within the guidance document, you'll see that the progress monitoring data should be and often does come from multiple observations, the student's progress monitoring data with what we must be using, those evidence-based interventions. It can also come from things like the integrated assessment report. Remember, we discussed that that must happen at least every 3 years. We can look at classroom-based assessments, work samples from the general education classroom, and a variety of other sources. So we're looking at a student holistically and ensuring that we're triangulating data, not just looking at one single data source. The guidance document gives us very specific information about how we develop goals, so we must always look at the Kentucky academic standards or early childhood standards if the child is preschool age to see what the student is expected to do at his age or grade levels or her age or grade levels. Then we're going to look at the student's data to see where they are currently performing as compared to their same age peers. And then we're going to look at, based on that student's relative strengths, what they're able to do right now, what needs or concerns they have, and what their current data is, what kind of a goal might they need to help to shrink that gap between the general education expectations and what a student is currently able to do. We have very specific guidance on what a goal must look like, and it must contain many parts, every single one of these parts, in order to meet the state standards for what a goal might look like. So we must have the audience, which is the student, what we are expecting them to do, the behavior, the circumstances or what the student is actually doing when we're measuring that goal, what tool we will use, and how often we will measure. So it might look something like this. When given 20 content-related vocabulary words, Mary will orally define, which means say out loud, 18 out of 20 words correctly for 4 consecutive probes, or 4 times in a row, as measured by a weekly checklist. So what role do the general education and special education teachers play in special education? Within the world of special education, a general education teacher and special education teacher should collaborate on the specially designed instruction a student is receiving, the supplementary aids and services the student has, what accommodations are provided, and then we also might join together to provide strategies that we know are evidence-based to support the learning of students with disabilities in general. Things like explicit instruction and co-teaching, universal design for learning, known as UDL. Kagan strategies are often used, and that increase student engagement. When we look at collaboration, we're looking at regularly scheduled planning time where we're reviewing the needs of students with disabilities, SWD, and the instructional modifications a student might need to make access. We're looking at the observations and progress monitoring data that a special education teacher or general education teacher is collecting, and any data that the general education teacher is collecting. Again, we're looking at that SDI, which is what the teacher is doing. It always begins with the special education teacher and then is supported by the general education teacher. So things like explicit instruction in the use of graphic organizers, or maybe scaffolded instruction in the use of a calming strategy. Those SAS are what the student needs to access the curriculum, and it has to be provided if it is listed in the IEP. At no time can a teacher say, I don't think John really needs that, I'm not doing it. If it's listed in the IEP, it must be provided. Things like a reader for text above ability level, a scribe for initial ideas and final product development might be things that are listed under a student's SAS if these are things that are a barrier to their access to the curriculum. Accommodations are used just for testing purposes. We can never only use things for testing at state testing times. If a student doesn't consistently use a reader for all tests across their entire academic year, then we cannot use them for accommodations. But if we list an accommodation as a reader, then it must be provided each time a student requires that support in a testing situation across their entire academic year. Co-teaching is one of the evidence-based practices. It's been pioneered by Dr. Marilyn Friend and has 6 models. The models on the end are kind of lower level co-teaching models that don't lead to that higher level growth by students with disabilities. Teachers that co-teach, which is a general education teacher and a special education teacher teaching together, when those two teachers teaching together use station teaching, parallel teaching, alternative teaching, and teaming, we see greater growth in the learning of students with disabilities. Occasionally, teachers might use one teach, one observe, which means one teacher is in the front of the classroom teaching, and it can be either the general education teacher or the special education teacher, and the other teacher is observing and collecting data, maybe on a student's behavior or how students are completing work. One teach, one assist would mean that a teacher is up in the front of the room and another teacher is circulating throughout answering questions. These two models do not have a large evidence base of student growth in their performance, and so should be used rarely. We definitely want to use things like station teaching, where students are rotating between two teachers who are teaching content to a smaller group of students. Parallel teaching, both teachers are teaching smaller groups of students the same content. Alternative teaching, we're breaking up and maybe one teacher is working on writing a topic sentence, the other teacher is working with a larger group on writing the body of a paragraph, and teaming, two teachers teaching together, showing different ways to solve algebraic expressions, for example. If you want to know more, there are fantastic resources that are accessible by searching for co-teaching in either Dr. Marilyn Friend or Dr. Wendy Morawski. So a few final thoughts. Often we hear, the test scores are so low in the United States. Why are our students not performing as high? And the reason that our test scores are different and considered lower sometimes is because in the United States,